Welcome to the Safety Map podcast. I'm Alyssa Decker, founder and developer of the Safety Map framework, and this is where we talk about how safety, not performance, is the foundation of healing. We're talking about healing that goes beyond coping skills and into structural change. I'm so glad you're here. Have you ever been working to change something and the harder you tried and the harder you pushed, the worse it got? Like the more effort you put in, the more willpower you applied, the more strategies and checklists and alarms you employed, the more books you read, the further away you seemed to get, or the more resistance you started to feel in your system. For many of us, this can look like telling yourself over and over again, you need to start going to the gym. And you set an alarm in your phone and you make a chart on your fridge to reward yourself for how many times you go to the gym in a week. And as time goes on, instead of those strategies getting you to the gym more, you find yourself going less. Why is that? What mechanism is at work in your safety map that causes pressure to move you further away from results? That's what we're talking about in this episode of the Safety Map podcast. Hey, Alyssa here. Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Safety Map podcast. If you are enjoying this content, if you're learning something here, or even just identifying with what we've been talking about, please take a moment to subscribe or follow on whatever platform you're currently listening in on. This really helps other people find the content, and it makes sure that you don't miss a single upcoming episode. Thank you so much. Now back to today's episode. For most of us listening to this episode today, cultural conditioning has taught us that willpower is king, discipline is everything. In fact, discipline is often equated with morality. In other words, the more tightly you control yourself, the more disciplined you are in your personal life, the better person you are. It has taught us that pushing through and just doing it and everything has urgency is somehow this pinnacle of human performance. That the people who do this best rise to the top. But is that really true? Is that actually how nervous systems work? Biologically speaking, pressure produces not greater performance. It produces things like vigilance, like shutdown, like anxiety, like masking, like avoidance. What's really fascinating is that in workplace research, what we are increasingly finding is that tightly controlled productivity markers and deadlines, especially when coupled with harsh penalties, actually tends to reduce productivity over time. It increases turnover, which will probably surprise no one listening. But it has the opposite of what is often the desired effect. In other words, the more tightly we control workers, the stricter we become by forcing compliance and productivity, the less optimal the end result. And this does not surprise me at all. Why? Because without naming it, that research is studying human nervous system behavior. We are humans. We have nervous systems. People who work in corporate environments or on production lines are not exempt from possessing a human nervous system. Human nervous systems restrict and close under pressure. So why? Why is that? Why do systems constrict or tighten under pressure? Well, it's because pressure often feels threatening to a nervous system. Pressure signals risk of failure, likelihood of rejection, exposure, punishment, inadequacy, disconnection, loss of belonging. In a workplace scenario, it may signal financial instability to a nervous system. So when the pressure rises, your nervous system is not just hearing motivation. It is scanning for consequences. In other words, the bar has gone up, the standard is raised, I now have this requirement for compliance, but that requirement comes with consequences if I do not perform adequately. And so we feel pressure, shame, moral threat, identity threat, connection threat, financial threat, all the threats, depending on the circumstances. When pressure rises and your safety map predicts increased threat, what happens? If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you already know the answer. Your system begins to organize defense. Your safety map perceives a threat and it immediately says, how do we defend against this threat? Notice that what your system is organizing in that moment is defense, not compliance. Now, compliance might be a defensive strategy, but compliance in itself is not what your system organizes. Your system, first and foremost, is interested in protecting you. In some cases, it may use compliance, depending on what has been successful for you in the past, to organize that protection. Okay? Which is why some people do have an experience where someone presents them with a very high external standard, or they hold themselves to a very high external standard, and they are then able to perform to meet that standard. But that is not because their system actually responded to the pressure from the standard. It is because their system used compliance as a protective strategy. Therefore, that compliance is not relieving pressure on the system. It is increasing pressure on that system, even in compliance. When pressure rises in nervous systems, they narrow, they tighten, they lose flexibility, curiosity tends to disappear, performance increases, sometimes honesty decreases. Think about it for a second. If you were working in an environment where there was incredibly high performance standards and you made a mistake, you likely would not default, naturally, comfortably at least, to telling the truth about your mistake. Your internal reaction would probably be closer to covering it up, ignoring it, pretending it didn't happen, hoping it didn't later show up on your record. Why? Because you are in defense mode. Your system is defending against the perceived threat. Here's some, and this shows up in every area of life. Pressured children lie more. Pressured partners hide more. Pressured employees mask more. Pressured clients comply. Pressured nervous systems become more defensive and less open. Pressure does not usually create openness. It creates defensiveness. And we can feel this in our relationships. Have you ever tried to corner your partner or a friend, like verbally back them into a corner to force them to admit the truth, and what you got instead was anger or increased defensiveness in proportion to the pressure you applied? Same thing is true of your internal safety map. Same response, same mechanism. Now, here's the trap that so many of us fall into. When we ask ourselves things, when we get caught in these loops, Why can't I just fix this? I should know this by now. I have been stuck here for so long. This is stupid. I need to fix this. I shouldn't be still reacting this way. Notice what's happening there. Self-pressure is still pressure. Those kinds of thought loops, those kinds of internal conversations are placing a tremendous amount of pressure on your system in a very similar way to the external pressure that others place on us. Internal threat from yourself equals threat. Just because it is you applying the pressure to you does not make it safe to your nervous system. Our own internal pressure can activate shame, right? Because shame is the guard, right? Shame is saying something here is not safe. So of course your internal pressure is going to activate your shame. It's a protective response from your system. Internal shame creates more pressure, more activation or dysregulation, more defensive behavior, even against yourself. And then we loop and we loop and we loop. And we repeat the cycle over and over and over again until the pressure becomes enough. Our system then chooses another defensive strategy. It may choose increased anxiety. It may choose shutdown. It may choose to move into compliance as a way of trying to relieve the pressure. We're often applying this pressure to ourselves because we feel like it would be safer for us, to our identity or connections or our aliveness, if we complied. That same pressure is tightening our system because our safety map is perceiving attack. It's perceiving threat. Think about it this way. If you had a friend who was standing in front of you saying the same things to you that you often say to yourself, you'd probably punch that friend in the face. Or at the very least, you'd stop taking their calls and stop answering the door, right? Why? Because we would react in a defensive way that said, you no longer get access to me if you're going to treat me that way. Internally, however, we don't have that same opportunity. We cannot refuse to allow access to ourselves because we ourselves are the threat to us. Okay? This is why forced change often backfires. This is why pressuring our systems over and over and over again often has completely the opposite of the intended effect. And why, going back to the example at the beginning, if you are trying to force your system into compliance, into going to the gym through alarms and checklists and public shaming and mentally trying to cajole and prod and force yourself to get there through willpower alone, your system begins to tighten, to shut down, to become resistant to the very thing you are trying to encourage. Sometimes systems do comply to pressure as a defensive strategy. Compliance is not the same as repair. Just because your system will do something in compliance does not mean the threat prediction has changed. It does not mean the rupture has repaired. It means your system is using compliance to negotiate safety. Those are two very different things. A system can perform safety long before it actually experiences safety. So what actually creates access? What actually opens your system to new information? What actually releases pressure so that new information can be introduced to your system? We're going to talk about that in more detail in the next episode, but here's a little sneak peek. Curiosity is what opens the door. Curiosity is what releases pressure. Relational safety, observation, reduced threat, staying curious, ending the internal war. These are the things that relieve pressure on your system instead of increasing the pressure on your system. So instead of asking, how do I force myself to change? How do I force my system into compliance and get my butt to the gym 3 times a week at all costs, or whatever it is for you? Try asking this: what pressure is my system responding to right now? And if you ask a question like that and you feel some resistance, some pull back internally, ask yourself this: what does my system believe will happen if I release the pressure? Oftentimes, systems are afraid because the pressure is familiar, the pressure is comfortable, the pressure has forced compliance. Try asking yourself, what is my system afraid will happen if I release the pressure? When you understand the answer to that question, you then have a very important key to beginning to work with your nervous system instead of trying to pressure it into compliance. You are not lazy. You are not resistant. You are not failing. You are not stupid. Your system may simply be tightening under pressure or using compliance to achieve safety instead of allowing access. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Safety Map podcast. In the show notes, I have linked a resource for you called Calm is Not the Same as Safety. If you're interested in going deeper and understanding what your nervous system is doing underneath the surface, beyond what you can see, this resource will help you dig in. The link is down below in the show notes. I'll see you soon in the next episode of the Safety Map podcast.